Imagine your roof is straw, your walls are mud, and the wind outside is loud enough to make your baby cry. Now imagine it doesn't stop. For days. No backup generator, no snowplow, no help coming. That's what a deadly snowstorm looked like for a medieval villager. While we complain about frost on the windshield, they face death by cold every winter. And yet somehow, they survived. In this episode, we'll uncover the gritty, ingenious, and downright bizarre ways peasants battled blizzards long before thermal socks and central heating. One storm even erased an entire village from the map. Let's dig in. Picture this. A wooden shack with no insulation, a fire barely flickering in a crude stone hearth, and a family of 7 huddled together beneath damp wool and straw. Outside, snow pounds the thatched roof so hard it sounds like a drum of doom. It's January in 14th century England, and the storm doesn't care who you are, how much grain you've saved, or how many prayers you've muttered. For medieval villagers, surviving a snowstorm wasn't about digging out the driveway. It was about staying alive, hour by frozen hour. Unlike kings and knights who could retreat behind castle walls, most medieval people lived in exposed, vulnerable settlements. Their homes weren't built for blizzards. They were built from what was available. In Northern Europe, that meant wattle and daub walls, straw roofs, and floors of beaten earth. Insulation? Not a chance. Wind howled through cracks in the walls, smoke choked the room because chimneys were rare, and water seeped in from below. A snowstorm could bury a village in a matter of hours, and the people in it had to fight for every breath of warmth. Food was the first line of defense, and often the most fragile. Winter preparations started in late summer. Grains were harvested, dried and stored in wooden bins or clay jars sealed with wax or pitch. Meat was salted or smoked. Vegetables were pickled. Apples and nuts were stashed in root cellars dug under homes. But here's the brutal twist. If any part of this chain broke, if the harvest failed, if rats got to the grain, if thieves stole the meat, people starved. There was no supermarket backup, no government aid, no plan B. Even for well-prepared villages, snowstorms could snap those fragile lifelines. Roads disappeared, rivers froze, and if your neighbor's cow died, your whole survival plan just collapsed. Livestock was everything. Warmth, milk, meat, manure for heating. In many cases, families brought their animals indoors during a storm, not out of affection, but necessity. Sharing a room with a steaming ox might stink, but it kept the temperature a few degrees higher. A cow's body heat could literally mean the difference between life and death. And still, things went wrong. Roofs caved in under heavy snow. Chimneys collapsed, sending burning thatch into living spaces. Entire barns were lost in a single night. In 1315, during the start of the Great Famine, back-to-back winter storms swept through northern France and England. Chroniclers wrote of villages flattened like crushed baskets and mothers feeding children bark boiled into mush. That's not metaphor. They ate tree bark. The real terror came from the cold itself. Frostbite wasn't a medical term, they just called it rot. Toes turned black, fingers swelled, ears split open. People lost limbs and still had to milk goats or haul water. And if someone collapsed in the snow while collecting firewood, there was a good chance their body would be found in spring, frozen in place like a statue of warning. Imagine being 10 years old and seeing your uncle dug out of the drift in April. But medieval villagers weren't helpless. They developed systems, some brilliant, some bizarre, to outlast winter's wrath. One of the first lines of defense was communal living. Families doubled up, not just to save resources, but to combine body heat. That might mean 10 or more people in a single-room hut, sleeping under furs, cloaks, and wool blankets thick with lice. It was smelly, noisy, and awkward, but it worked. Then came the practice of keeping the fire. In many villages, one home, usually the Reeves or the local millers, was designated as the central hearth. If a storm hit suddenly, people could run there for warmth. Fire tending was a sacred duty. Letting it go out could get you fined, or worse, because relighting a fire from scratch in freezing weather was no small task. Forget matches. You'd need flint, tinder, and precious time. If your fire went out during a storm, you didn't just shiver. You died. Fuel was another constant battle. Wood had to be gathered in late autumn and stored off the ground. Wet wood smoked. Rotten wood exploded. Dung was a fallback. Dried animal waste burned hot and long. Some desperate families even tore apart furniture, fences, or thatch to feed the flames. It was a grim math. Burn your roof to save your body. And yes, people actually did it. Now let's not pretend everyone faced the same odds. The local lord? He had stone walls, multiple hearths, layers of servants, and a pantry guarded like a treasury. If his firewood got low, he took yours. If your barn collapsed, he might offer shelter in exchange for a year of unpaid labor. Medieval survival wasn't fair. It was brutally hierarchical. And snowstorms didn't just test nature's cruelty, they tested human cruelty too. Still, villagers found ways to push back. Mutual aid wasn't a modern invention. Entire hamlets created emergency stores, shared grain bins, or community pigs. If a family lost everything, the others pitched in. Not out of charity, but survival instinct. If your neighbor died, no one fed your chickens while you were sick. No one helped dig you out if your door froze shut. Alone, you were doomed. Together, you had a shot. And through all this, religion hovered over everything like smoke in a low-roofed hut. People didn't just fear the storm, they spiritualized it. Snow wasn't weather, it was judgment, a punishment for greed, lust, or poor tithing. Priests gave sermons about hell being cold, not hot, a place where the sinful wandered naked in eternal frost. Villagers crossed themselves during thunder, left bread offerings at crossroads, and whispered to the Virgin Mary when the roof began to groan under snow weight. But faith had another side. It gave comfort. Songs were sung, candles lit, prayers repeated like lullabies. Children were told stories of saints who endured snow by divine grace. The tale of St. Cuthbert walking barefoot in the snow as penance made suffering feel noble. Misery became holy, and that gave it meaning. Here's a modern comparison for you. Imagine your Wi-Fi goes out for a day during a snowstorm. Maybe your heater falters. Panic sets in. Now strip away the electricity, the insulation, the food delivery apps, the emergency services. Replace your windows with a hole covered in pig bladder. That's not drama, that was daily life. And people still managed to live, love, raise children, and outlast blizzards with nothing but each other and a stubborn will not to freeze. But here's the kicker. As brutal as these storms were, they didn't just kill people. They changed entire villages. Who helped? Who hoarded? Who prayed louder than they worked? All of that shaped reputation and status long after the snow melted. Surviving a winter storm didn't just test your body, it tested your soul. Next, we'll dig into the strangest adaptations of all, why some villagers danced, how others fasted, and the bizarre rituals they used to try and control the weather itself. Because when you're freezing to death in a world without science, sometimes your only weapon is belief. For many medieval villagers, brute survival during a snowstorm wasn't just about food or fire. It was about confronting a world that seemed angry, alive, and wildly unpredictable. And when rational options ran out, they turned to something far older than science: ritual. In the dead of winter, when storms had lasted too long, roofs sagged under ice, and the last of the pickled onions had been eaten, people got desperate. And desperation makes people do strange things. From the Alps to the moors of Yorkshire, medieval folk didn't just hide from snowstorms. They tried to fight back. Not with shovels, but with dancing, fasting, and full-blown magical thinking. Let's start with the snow dances. In the Baltic regions, farmers believed that stomping in circles around their fields could call out the frost spirits. Some called it warding. Others saw it as a kind of challenge. Wake up the earth, stomp it back to life. It was usually led by the oldest woman in the village, barefoot, chanting names of old gods no priest dared to repeat. And when snow fell even harder the next day, nobody questioned the ritual. They just assumed the gods were angry and tried harder. Other villages fasted as a group. A kind of communal punishment meets sacrifice. They'd refuse food not because they had none, but because they believed abstaining might show heaven they were humble. Families would go entire days on broth or stale crusts, offering what little they had to the altar. Did it work? Who knows? But the fasting created solidarity. A shared hardship that said, "We are suffering together. Please let it stop snowing." In the French countryside, particularly in the region of Auvergne, there were reports of villagers tying straw dolls to trees and whipping them as scapegoats. The dolls were said to represent the spirit of winter, and by punishing it, they hoped to drive the cold away. It was a strange blend of paganism and Christian influence, officially frowned upon but quietly tolerated, especially when the snow buried roads and no bishop could get through to scold them. Then there were the bells. Oh, the bells. In parts of Germany and Flanders, it became common to ring the church bells continuously during storms. The belief was that the sound would break the clouds or confuse demons riding the wind. Entire villages took turns at the ropes, their fingers bleeding, lungs raw, praying the sound would carry high enough to chase the blizzard away. It never worked, but it kept them moving, kept them warm, gave them something to do besides sit in silence and wait for the roof to cave in. But these rituals weren't just weird quirks, they were coping mechanisms. In a world where weather wasn't explained by jet streams or pressure systems, everything was personal. A harsh storm didn't just happen. It came because someone sinned, because the baker was cheating scales, because a girl skipped mass, because the woodsman cursed under his breath while chopping holy oak. And if the storm dragged on, paranoia grew. Fingers pointed, whispers spread. Maybe it wasn't just bad luck. Maybe it was witchcraft. Witch accusations during winter spikes weren't rare. In the harshest years of the Little Ice Age, entire communities blamed elderly women for calling down the snow. Some were chased out of town. Others were beaten, drowned, or worse. In the early 1400s, one Swiss village burned a woman for supposedly freezing the local well. The evidence? She refused to share her firewood and muttered to herself during storms. But even in all this chaos, some people truly did have an edge: herbalists, foragers, and those who knew how to work with the land even in the coldest months. These weren't doctors, but every village had one or two folk who could find frost-sweetened berries, dig up winter roots, or dry herbs that soothed frostbite and coughing. They became invaluable, walking from hut to hut with pouches of elder bark, lard, and garlic. Not miracle cures, but comfort. Children, too, had their roles. It might sound cruel, but they were often the ones sent to dig paths, check on neighbors, or gather ice to melt for water. Their small hands could fit into cracks, their feet into frozen boots that adults couldn't manage. And they were taught, young, that snow killed. There was no sugarcoating. One mistake, a lost mitten, a tumble in the woods, and you didn't get a second chance. They weren't coddled. They were trained. Yet, for all the hardship, something else happened during these storms. Community grew stronger. Neighbors who barely spoke all year shared soup. Widows were taken in. The blacksmith's family and the shepherd's might sleep side by side, trading stories to stay awake. And through that closeness came an emotional endurance that no fur cloak could match. Architecture also evolved in response to snow's wrath. Homes began to slant their roofs more steeply to prevent buildup. Doorways were elevated with stone steps so snow wouldn't pile inside. Some homes added trapdoors in their ceilings, an escape route in case the snow blocked the only door. And chimneys, once rare, became symbols of wealth and warmth. A working flue wasn't just status, it was survival. And then there were the feasts. Yes, feasts. Because sometimes the storm didn't come until after months of prep. And villagers, knowing what might lie ahead, threw what might have looked like celebrations, but were really morale weapons. Salted pork, bread from the last of the grain, ale brewed before the frost. A storm feast was a way to stock your belly before the lean days. But it was also a psychological shield. If we eat well now, we might just remember it when the hunger hits. Compare that to now. Snow day hits, and people rush to buy milk, eggs, Netflix subscriptions. Back then, they rushed to forgive each other, to make peace. Because the snow didn't just threaten life, it threatened eternity. If you died in a storm, frozen and unshriven, your soul might wander, cold and alone. So priests gave extra blessings. Confessions were whispered behind woodpiles. And even non-believers bowed their heads just in case. And yet, not everyone feared the storms equally. Some saw them as cleansing, as necessary. They believed the snow purified the village, cleared disease, and tested loyalty. A hard winter was like a trial by ordeal. Those who emerged were tougher, wiser, and more respected. A boy who carried wood for a dozen homes wasn't just a helper, he was a hero. A girl who stayed up all night tending a hearth while her mother coughed in bed became a legend. The storm gave as much as it took. Stories, memories, and hard-earned respect. But as we'll see next, not every village made it. Sometimes the rituals failed, the fires went out, and the world forgot you ever existed. In the next part, we'll look at the villages that vanished entirely, buried in snow, abandoned in silence, and left behind as haunting reminders of what happened when winter truly won. Not every medieval village made it through the winter. Some didn't just suffer, they disappeared, vanished under snowdrifts, swallowed by silence, never rebuilt. To this day, archaeologists find hints of settlements, stone outlines, collapsed walls, scattered tools, left exactly where their owners dropped them. These weren't war zones. These were victims of weather. Villages where the last footsteps were muffled by falling snow and nobody came back in spring. One of the most chilling examples comes from the Scottish Highlands. In the early 1300s, a string of hamlets in what's now Glen Lyon were wiped off the map after a winter of relentless storms. Local legends tell of a white death that crept through the valley, stealing heat from homes and breath from babies. What likely happened was a series of back-to-back snowstorms that cut the villages off from each other and from food supplies. With no way out and no help coming, people froze. The few who survived either fled or joined neighboring clans, leaving their stone huts to collapse under decades of snow and moss. These aren't just tales. In Scandinavia, entire farming communities disappeared during the harshest years of the Little Ice Age. Fields were abandoned, churches locked up, names erased from records. The snow didn't just bury people, it buried history. And what's terrifying is how fast it happened. Miss one harvest, lose 2 oxen, and then the storm hits? That's all it took. But what makes these collapses more tragic is that they weren't caused by ignorance. These were people who knew winter, who prepared, who stored, patched, prayed, planned, and still lost. Because sometimes the storm just wins. One of the worst culprits was isolation. Most medieval villages weren't cities. They were tiny pockets of life scattered across vast countryside. A few dozen people at most. When snow blocked roads or froze rivers, you were on your own. No messenger, no supply chain, no cavalry riding in with sacks of grain. And once desperation hit, people started making terrible decisions. Families would burn tools, eat seed grain meant for spring, slaughter milk animals just to get through another day. These were short-term survival moves, but long-term death sentences. Come thaw, there'd be nothing left to plant, nothing to plow with, no milk to nourish the children. And if the storm returned before help did, that was it. There's a haunting account from a monastery in Bohemia, circa 1379. A traveling friar wrote of finding a village struck dumb by cold. Doors creaked in the wind, but no one answered. Fires had long gone out. Livestock bones lay scattered in the snow. In one hut, he found 2 skeletons still huddled together beneath a collapsed roof. No signs of violence, just surrender. And yet, for every lost village, there were those who adapted and endured by evolving past traditional survival. They abandoned pride, they broke rules, they chose survival over status. One strategy was relocation. Some families didn't wait for the snow to trap them. They fled before it came, packed their essentials, slaughtered what livestock they could carry, and moved to lowland areas or into forest shelters. It wasn't easy. You had to leave your home behind, risk bandits, and hope someone would take you in. But it was better than freezing in place. These storm refugees, as they were later called, formed temporary communities of survivors. Some stayed together for generations. Others turned to trade, bartering firewood, salt, or smoked meat in advance for the promise of spring labor. If a family had a skilled weaver or blacksmith, they could offer future services in exchange for winter goods. Entire economies emerged based on cold season credit. Your reputation meant everything. If you were lazy or dishonest, nobody fronted you food. Trust kept people alive. And then there was innovation. While most homes were built the same way for centuries, some villagers began tweaking the blueprints. One notable example was in the Carpathians, where families started building semi-underground homes. Dug into hillsides with turf roofs and animal skins over the doorways, these earth homes were warmer, wind-resistant, and camouflaged from raiders. They took more effort to build, but the payoff was survival. Similarly, in alpine regions, some communities built above the tree line in stone bunkers near geothermal springs. The heat kept the interiors just warm enough to prevent freezing, and snowdrifts formed natural insulation. These weren't luxury chalets, they were damp, crowded caves, but they were life-saving. And they proved one thing: the storm could be outsmarted. Religion, too, adapted. Some monasteries became de facto storm shelters. During particularly bad winters, abbots would open their gates to villagers, offering soup, straw beds, and shared prayers. These weren't acts of pure charity. They served to increase church loyalty, tithe collection, and local power, but they saved lives. In fact, many rural churches expanded their basements into warming halls just for this purpose. But nothing tested a village like the second storm. That's what they called it when, after barely surviving one blizzard, another hit within days or weeks. The second storm was always worse, not because it was colder, but because people were already weakened. Their stores were low, their strength gone, their hope dimmed. That's when the cracks showed. Some villagers hoarded, hiding sacks of grain under their floors. Others resorted to theft. If things got really bad, murder wasn't out of the question. There are records of entire families vanishing during winters, only for their bones to be found near neighbors' homes come thaw. Starvation changes people, turns them into ghosts before they even die. Still, the second storm also revealed the strongest. The ones who shared, who took in orphaned children, who dug out neighbors without being asked. Those were remembered. Their names passed down in stories, their acts recited beside fires for generations. Survival wasn't just about being tough. It was about being decent when decency cost you everything. One of the most powerful examples of endurance came from the village of Kelmendi in the Balkans. In the winter of 1454, a massive storm isolated the area for 40 days. Food ran out. Livestock froze. People began boiling leather and pine needles. But instead of turning on each other, they created a rotating meal system. Every household, no matter how poor, gave something. Turns with the only working fire, dried apples, one egg from a half-starved chicken. When spring came, not a single villager had died. To this day, Kelmendi has a festival in late March celebrating not just the end of winter, but the choices that made it through. So while some villages crumbled, others rewrote the rules of survival. They stopped thinking in terms of enduring until spring and started thinking in terms of resilience, adaptability, and moral grit. They stopped waiting for the storm to pass and started living through it. Next, we'll explore the long-term effects of these snowbound struggles, how they reshaped medieval culture, architecture, seasonal rituals, and even our modern ideas of winter hardship. Because the storm didn't just change where people lived, it changed who they were. By the time Europe clawed its way into the late medieval period, the snowstorms that once decimated entire villages had done more than just kill. They'd transformed the way people thought, lived, built, and prayed. Because after centuries of fighting the cold with desperation, medieval communities began responding with structure. They didn't just react to the snow, they planned for it. The first and most visible shift came in architecture. The standard peasant hut got an upgrade. Steeper roof angles became the norm, forcing snow to slide off rather than crush the building. Roofs were reinforced with timber crossbeams or slate, especially in mountainous areas. Thatched roofs, while cheap, were a liability in deep winter. Wet snow turned them into sponges, and the weight could snap the rafters overnight. So wealthier peasants, yes, they existed, shifted to wooden shingles or even turf layering, which insulated better and resisted rot. Windows were minimized and, when used, covered with oiled parchment, animal stomach lining, or thin horn to keep the wind out. Shutters became crucial, not decorative, closed every night and sealed with clay or cloth strips. Some families started building storm porches, small entrance zones that helped trap heat and kept snow from blowing straight into the hearth area when doors opened. And what about heating? Fireplaces became more than just functional. They were central. Central hearths gave way to corner fireplaces with chimneys that actually vented smoke instead of letting it choke the room. Some homes added built-in benches next to the hearth, stone-lined to absorb heat during the day and radiated at night. Clay bricks or heated stones were wrapped in cloth and placed in bedding, primitive hot water bottles that let people sleep without shivering themselves awake every 2 hours. Village design also evolved. Homes began clustering tighter together, not just for social reasons, but for thermal logic. Less space between structures meant less wind exposure. Narrow lanes created windbreaks. Some settlements added communal halls, large fire-warmed buildings where people could gather during especially violent storms. These spaces were part shelter, part town square, part survival strategy. But the cold didn't just reshape homes. It rewired culture. Festivals shifted to align with weather. Candlemas, celebrated in early February, became a deeply symbolic marker, the halfway point through winter. It was a moment of cautious hope, and not by coincidence one of the few times people dared to light all their candles at once. The glow wasn't just pretty, It was spiritual armor, a way to push back the darkness, both physical and metaphysical. Songs, too, changed tone. Winter lullabies were passed down through generations. Not cheerful ditties, but rhythmic laments and chants meant to lull children to sleep while the wind howled outside. They weren't just for comfort, they were teaching tools. Songs reminded children not to stray from the path, not to waste firewood, not to open the door after dark. Oral traditions became rule books wrapped in melody, and the calendar itself adapted. Farming cycles bent to the new climate reality. More emphasis was placed on autumn harvests and preservation. Cabbage, onions, leeks, and root vegetables became prized not just for nutrition, but longevity. Brewing schedules were adjusted to produce thicker, heartier ales that held up during the cold months. And laws began to appear around food hoarding, price gouging, and firewood theft, proof that even governments were finally recognizing winter as more than an act of God. But the cold left its fingerprints on morality, too. In regions hardest hit by blizzards, entire belief systems shifted toward endurance. In Alpine and Baltic folklore, saints were no longer just radiant miracle workers. They were winter warriors. Figures like Saint Bernard, who crossed snowy mountains to rescue lost pilgrims, became symbols of divine perseverance. Saint Nicholas, before Coca-Cola turned him red and jolly, was known as a protector of snowbound travelers and chimney-sneaking gift-giver who reminded children to behave, or else. Judgment shifted as well. Where once sin was associated with fire and brimstone, now many sermons warned of eternal cold. Hell wasn't just a furnace. It could be an endless blizzard, a place of isolation and silence. This reflected the psychological toll of winter. People weren't just afraid of dying from frostbite. They were afraid of being forgotten, frozen into history like those vanished villages no one ever rebuilt. Economics also transformed under winter's rule. Salt became strategic, not just for flavor or preservation, but for thawing. Entire cartloads were shipped and taxed based on their usefulness in winter. The same went for furs. Beaver pelts, bear hides, and wolf fur skyrocketed in value, especially in trade towns like Novgorod, Krakow, and Lubeck. Fur was wealth. The warmer your cloak, the higher your status. And with that came inequality. Lords wrapped in velvet and fox fur issued firewood quotas to peasants who slept 5 to a bed. Guilds developed special winter contracts, paying workers more for tasks done in cold months, but only for certain trades. Masons and thatchers got paid. Firewood splitters didn't. As always, the cold hit hardest at the bottom. Still, survival bred ingenuity. In the Netherlands, villagers dug snow trenches to protect livestock paths. In Poland, entire barns were built partially underground, using the earth's natural insulation to keep animals alive. And in northern Italy, ice houses became standard, structures designed to trap and store ice not just for food preservation, but water collection. If the well froze, you melted your wall. But nothing shaped collective memory like shared suffering. Families kept winter journals, not diaries in the modern sense, but tallies. How many candles burned, how many loaves lasted, who got sick, who shared, who didn't. These records became moral compasses. Your legacy wasn't just what you left behind, it was how you endured the worst season of the year. Children were taught to recite their family's snow history like scripture, and it created a cultural divide that lingered for centuries. Those who lived in mild climates were seen as soft. They don't know snow, people would say with a sneer. They don't know cold. Winter became a badge of honor, a brutal rite of passage. To survive it was to be forged by it. Compare that to now. We count the days until ski season opens. They counted the days until the sun stayed above the horizon long enough to melt a path to the river. And yet, that fear gave birth to something profound, resilience as identity. In the coldest corners of medieval Europe, people stopped seeing themselves as victims of winter. They became partners in the struggle, designers of their own fate, builders of homes that pushed back against snow, tellers of stories that outlived the storm. Because even as roofs cracked, fires died, and roads vanished, one thing always remained: the will to remember, to learn, to teach. In the final part, we'll reflect on how those medieval lessons of survival echo through time, how their grit, grief, and raw humanity continue to shape the way we think about winter, danger, and what it really means to endure. The snow eventually stopped falling. It always did. But the legacy of those long, brutal winters outlasted the storms themselves, etched not in stone but in how people built their lives for centuries to come. Medieval villagers didn't just survive deadly snowstorms, they built entire worldviews around them. And the deeper you dig, the clearer it becomes. Those frozen nights shaped not only how they lived, but how they understood the world, their place in it, and each other. It started with memory. Survival in winter meant remembering the last one. What failed, what worked, who died, and why. This wasn't nostalgia. It was a survival mechanism. Villagers passed down oral histories of the Black Frost of 1317, or the Long Storm of 44, the way we remember pandemics or wars. And they weren't shy about blaming those who didn't do their part. Families carried reputations. The one who hoarded, the one who broke into the storehouse, the one who shared soup every night. Those reputations lasted longer than the footprints in the snow. Community was no longer just a social unit, it was a survival organism. You didn't chop wood alone. You didn't walk to the well without telling someone. You didn't sleep in an unheated room unless there was absolutely no choice. That mindset bled into the rest of the year. Harvests were planned communally. Bread was baked in shared ovens. Disputes were settled fast before they could fester into grudges. Because if you carried bitterness into December, it could kill someone by January. Even family structure bent to winter. Elders who might have been seen as burdens in warmer months became sources of priceless wisdom when the temperature dropped. They knew which root cellar stayed driest, which herbal mix soothed chilblains, which trick kept snow from collapsing the roof. Grandmothers were fire watchers. Grandfathers taught children how to find dry kindling under fresh snow. Age wasn't just respected. It was heat, knowledge, survival. Children weren't spared either. From a young age, they were taught winter rules like commandments. Don't step on river ice unless the dog does first. Don't eat snow unless it's clean and from the top layer. Always keep a piece of dry moss in your pouch. It might be your only fire starter. And above all, never open the door at night unless you're ready to pay the cost. Cold wasn't just weather. It was something alive, waiting for mistakes. Religion took those fears and gave them shape. Saints multiplied around winter themes. Holy days became as much about weather as theology. Stories were told of angels lighting hearths for the pious, or demons snuffing fires in the homes of the greedy. One tale from 15th century Bavaria tells of a traveler saved from a snowstorm by a glowing child who vanished into the hills, interpreted, of course, as the Christ child watching over the faithful. Whether true or not, such tales warmed hearts better than fire ever could. This spiritual lens also affected how people saw death. Passing away in winter wasn't just sad, it was symbolic. A good death meant dying near the hearth, surrounded by family, with candles lit and prayers spoken. A bad death meant vanishing in the woods, found months later with hands frozen around a stick, eyes wide in terror. Burial was difficult when the ground froze, so bodies were often kept in barns or sheds, carefully wrapped, blessed daily, and visited until the earth softened enough to accept them. That alone reshaped how people viewed time. Seasons weren't just environmental, they were spiritual milestones. Winter wasn't a pause between planting and harvesting. It was a crucible, the place where you proved yourself, where you remembered what mattered, where you prepared for the moment the sun would rise high again and life could begin anew. And yet, despite everything, the storms, the death, the cold that crept into bones and never quite left, people still celebrated, not in denial, but in defiance. Yuletide wasn't just about Christ's birth. It was a rebellion against the dark. Singing, drinking, feasting. It was all a way to say, we're still here. You haven't broken us yet. That wasn't indulgence. It was psychological armor. Even marriage customs reflected winter survival. In some parts of Northern Europe, couples who married just before winter often lived with extended family until spring. Not just because of space, but because the early months were a test. If you could endure one winter together, sharing lice-ridden blankets and half-frozen stew, you might just make it through life. And those who lost a partner in winter were given special status, seen not just as widows or widowers, but as storm survivors. Trade, too, became part of this winter culture. Entire networks developed for seasonal supply. Coastal towns sent dried fish inland in exchange for wool. Mountain villages traded snow-resistant tools and salt for grains. The frozen rivers that once blocked trade routes became highways when thick enough to support sleds. Markets would be held directly on the ice. Tent stalls, fire pits, goods displayed on furs. Risky? Yes, but practical. And honestly, a little thrilling. But perhaps the most lasting impact was psychological. Medieval villagers learned to live with uncertainty in a way we can barely comprehend. No weather forecasts, no centralized aid, just instinct, community, and hard-earned wisdom. The snow didn't give you time to panic. It gave you choices: act, adapt, or disappear. And those choices left echoes. In rural villages across Europe today, you'll still find traditions rooted in this legacy. The extra candle lit in January, the festival feast in late February, the old songs sung in dialects long dead. We think of them as folklore, but for their ancestors they were lifelines. Even our language remembers. The dead of winter, snowed in, cold shoulder. These aren't just phrases. They're scraps of memory, carried forward from centuries when frost knocked at the door every year. And the only thing between survival and silence was the human refusal to give up. So next time you're watching snowfall from the safety of a heated room, think of them. The mother rubbing lard on her children's feet because there were no boots. The boy hauling water before dawn so the fire wouldn't go out. The old man muttering prayers while the roof creaked ominously overhead. Think of the noise: wind screaming, wood snapping, cattle lowing, and the silence that came after, if they didn't make it. Think of what it means to survive, not because of modern technology, but because someone remembered how to build a fire, share a crust of bread, and keep singing even when the sky turned white with hunger. The medieval villagers survived deadly snowstorms not through luck, but through knowledge, courage, and sheer stubborn humanity. And we are here, warm, fed, and safe, because they did. We like to believe we've outsmarted nature. Thermostats, four-wheel drives, triple-pane glass. But the truth? Medieval villagers survived winter not with comfort, but with grit, memory, and community. They didn't just make it through the cold. They adapted to it, shaped their lives around it, and passed down the lessons in every story, stone, and song. So ask yourself, would you have made it? Could you survive a week with no heat, no food delivery, and no escape? Just your neighbors and your will to endure? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Which survival tactic shocked you the most? And what would you do if the snow didn't stop falling? If you're fascinated by the raw toughness of real medieval life, subscribe and hit that bell. We've got a lot more history where this came from.